Welcome back. This is part 6. What are the effects of errors? Let's start with the effects of errors on us as performers. What does this do to us, and what effect does it have on us? I believe our perception of the ruinous effects of errors on an imperfect performance can lead us to performance anxiety and the many known bad side effects of performance anxiety, which include mental, physical, emotional, social effects that it can have on us. And it is a very real thing. Performance anxiety affects most musicians, some to the point of having it be very debilitating and they can hardly perform. And it doesn't affect only amateur level players. This affects everyone, regardless of status. Even the greatest players on earth are oftentimes well known to be afflicted with performance anxiety. And where does this come from? I believe it's our fear of failure. We do not want to fail. And errors, or less than a perfect performance, is a type of failure for most people. So, does that mean that we can take a devil-may-care attitude toward performance? Absolutely not. We can't just say, it doesn't matter what happens, because it does matter what happens. We want to play well. So when the music is really serious and complicated, let's say you're playing the Bach chaconne or something, taking a carefree, careless attitude toward it isn't going to make for a good performance of Bach, or any other composer for that matter. So I believe that we still have to prepare our music really well. Really well. We have to work really hard at that aspect. But instead of worrying when we get out on stage whether or not we're going to miss a note, we need to take on a more artistic or creative or improvisational mindset as a performer. This really will help us when we're on stage if we do not think about missing notes, like not playing to not miss notes, or playing in a guarded or held back fashion where we're not giving our best. Instead, we have to try to find a way to make our pieces sound interesting and artistic and creative. I think that's a much better, more healthy mindset to have. So, can anything less than a perfect performance be considered good or worthwhile? So when we think about that, think about making mistakes on stage, and I am the champion of that. I've probably made more errors in performances on stage than anyone I know. And so in our mind, can anything less than a perfect performance be worthwhile? And I used to really think in my own head that if I didn't play without missing notes, the performance wasn't any good. And so I would strive for that. But then, of course, I was always frustrated because, of course, I would miss notes and then it would start to unravel. So my feeling is that we can no more play a perfect concert than we can count to infinity. Neither one is possible. And since all performances are less than perfect in some way, no matter how small, we really should learn to think in terms of excellence rather than perfection. Back to that idea we talked about earlier in one of the earlier segments. Let's reassess how we're looking at errors, and the effects of them on us will be diminished, I believe, if we think in terms of excellence rather than perfection. So here's the way that I did this, and it really helped me very much. In my performances, I started to think of them on a graded scale from 1 to 10. 1 being the worst performance I've ever had, and 10 being my personal best. And then I started trying to rank my performances within that scale, 1 to 10. 7, 8, and 9 are really good performances. They are not maybe your very personal best, but they're good and they're professional and they're not laden with errors. You're not falling apart at the seams, etc. And so, to me, what I started looking for was to try to achieve what I would rank myself as a 7, an 8, or a 9. I'm not worrying about hitting 10, my personal best, every time I go out there, because it doesn't happen very often. 7, 8, or 9 is good, and it's good enough. It's a professional level of playing. If it's 6 or below, you got some work to do. You got to figure out some things. How come things aren't going well? And you need to work on them. Probably lack of preparation would be the main factor, or some debilitating types of performance anxiety that need to be overcome, etc. So anyway, if you're getting a 7 or above, you're in good shape. And that's an excellent performance. And that's how we need to think instead of our personal best every single time. If we're not getting a 10, it's 0. That's how I used to think. It was either, outstanding and a 10, or it was nothing. And that's just the wrong way to look at it. It's not helpful. So ultimately, we have to look at errors as information. This is the most important point. I should have probably started with this. Errors are simply information. When we make an error, it's just information coming in and we need to assess it. So let's take on an error-friendly approach to practicing and performing, where an error is simply information coming in. We need to look at the cause of the error and how to fix it so that we are not doomed to repeat it over and over again. All right, so look at it that way, and it'll give you a healthy approach to thinking about mistakes or errors in performance. And then lastly, I'd like to close this section with the effects of errors on an audience. And this was a really wonderful study that I read. And they manipulated a video. And they had a pianist performing, and they played. They had a performance where all the notes in the piece were played without any flaws. And then they had another performance where there were several major flaws in the middle of a piece. And then what they did was they actually swapped the video and the audio parts so that some listeners watching and listening to this video would hear a perfect performance, but they would see a person whose face looked like they were stressed or like having a bad performance, even though they weren't missing notes. And then likewise, they had a person playing with some errors in the middle, but looking as if nothing was happening and they were playing perfectly. And the funny thing is, it's our expressions that often lend credence to errors to our audience members. So if we can play and not show them, keep our poker face and not show them that we're having a hard time, they tend to not notice errors at all. Which is a very important thing to think about. It doesn't mean we have to be completely stoic and expressionless, but what we can't do is sit up there and really, show frustration or fear or whatever if we're having a hard time with a piece and looking like we're struggling and not knowing what to do. Because then the audience feels sorry for us, and then they tend to not like a performance as much. So performances are deemed very, very good if the performer appears as if they are in control. And they may or may not be, but that doesn't matter. They just have to look the part. So it's a little bit of acting that goes on. And then finally, I think we have to avoid the domino effect of errors. This happens to most people when they play. It happens to me a lot. If I make one mistake, then all of a sudden they get rattled. And the next note falls, and the next one, and the next one. And pretty soon the train is off the rails, and we have a train wreck, a memory slip. We have to start over or whatever. And that's the type of thing we need to avoid. So back to that Miles Davis quote, it's not the mistake that matters. It's what you do after it that really counts. So find a way in your practice that if you make a mistake, it doesn't rattle you and you're able to get back on track as quickly as possible. And it's been shown that really good professional players are simply better at doing that than amateur level players are. They just get back on track faster. And so the perception of the error is much smaller and often not caught at all. All right, hope that helps. And I'll see you in our final segment 7.